200 years of the history of capitalism, the history of labor, that one way to think about it, structuring it, is that we have a return of merchant capital is one of the ways to think about the world today. That is, if you begin in 1810, when it was an era in which merchants of various sorts, the traders from Birmingham, of Liverpool and New York and Boston, were trading and selling, buying and selling commodities produced from, basically the American South or the Caribbean, the merchants were clearly the dominant elements in the supply chains of that era. And these merchants would, of course, become bankers. All the great banks of the 19th century, Baring Brothers and Lehman Brothers and Brown Brothers Harriman, they all had started out as merchants, in UK or France, for that matter, or the US. Okay, so that was kind of the era which had a kind of resemblance to today. That's a kind of unfree labor of various sorts, producing commodities, and then the merchants selling them around the world, from the East India Company to what. Okay, that era ends, dramatically and in a revolutionary fashion with basically the middle of the 19th century with the Civil War, which is the destruction of that kind of really the alliance of the New York merchants and the slaveocracy, which was very, very much there. Lehman Brothers were German Jewish immigrants in Montgomery, Alabama, selling Confederate bonds, in London in the middle of the war. I mean, they were totally, incomplicit. Anyway, then of course they moved their operation to New York. So that era ends, and we have an era of industrial capitalism, but really of the vertically integrated corporation, which exists from the late 19th century, really the era of the consolidation to the trust to sometime in the 1980s, probably. I mean, it still exists today, of course, but that's the dominant era, and in which as I say in my book on Walmart, I wrote, selling stuff was sort of a tertiary. After the steel had been poured, the cars assembled, then somehow, the stuff got sold. But that was kind of a side, that wasn't that important. That was sort of what happened later on. Peter Drucker said, what is this world of distribution? We know nothing about it. He wrote that in the early 1960s. And he was sort of right. He called it the dark continent. A little bit racist, but nevertheless, he called it that. So that was, very utterly brief and broad children. Anyway, so that era of vertically integrated, corporations in which the merchants are. One example of this is the Fortune 500. When that is created in 1955 by Fortune Luce, all the merchants, all the retailers, they weren't even allowed on the list. Sears was not on the list, not admitted. Sorry, wrong club. And Woolworths and all the others. Then, of course, in 1996, when the editors of Fortune say, what is manufacturing is kind of dematerializing into some other thing in which, what's the distinction between a manufacturer or an industrial and a trader? Well, I think we better admit the merchants, the retailers onto the list. And so, bingo, Walmart pops up number 4, and then soon number 1 on the Fortune 500 list. Anyway, so what happens in the 1980s, sometime in the 80s, in that period, we have a world in which I do think in some ways resembles that of the early 19th century, in which the merchants are, the key players, at least in a certain realm of capitalism. I'm leaving out finance, and I'm very happy that Louis Hyman and Julia Ott are here to talk about that, and also Michael Hilliard. I'm leaving that out to some extent, but they are now the dominant players, and clearly, all the discussions. I returned to the session just before this. clearly the so-called, I love this, the vendors. Foxconn is a vendor to Apple. I think of vendors as kind of selling pretzels on the streets of New York. But here's a company with 1.2 million workers in China, and they're a vendor. But that encapsulates their subordinate position in the supply chain to the brands and the and the new retailers, the Walmart, the Apples, etc., who are clearly in the command of the global supply chain. And so that's the world today. And I make one other comment. I discuss this more elaborately in an article in Ilwich that hopefully in the book I'm writing, is that the meaning of the word commodity. I don't mean it in a kind of Marxist sense, which everything is bought and sold is a commodity. I mean it in a kind of more sense of the way in which merchants 200 years ago today, that a commodity is kind of a product that's fungible. Its price rises and falls because there's a lot of different ways to produce it. And so while it's clear a bale of cotton was a commodity then and now, or a barrel of a certain kind of oil, I also think that a cell phone, or maybe now an iPad, is a commodity. It's very complicated, of course. You couldn't, but in a way, it functions in terms of price and in terms of its fungibility in a certain way as a commodity. I mean, the reason that brands spend so much money trying to be brands is they're trying to avoid the death threat to them, which is their products turn into commodities. They hate that. You do that anyway. Okay, so that's my larger project, and of course that has tremendous implications for labor around the world. And here in this little paper, I'm not going to read that because I want one aspect of it. And I think what the issue is today, and this has risen, it was clear, the Bangladesh situation just in the last 2 months, but it goes back to the origins of the idea, or to the origins of the supply chain idea and concept and reality, is we have a situation in which you have control without ownership. You have authority without responsibility. And this is both legal and if the Walmarts of the world and others could make it there without moral responsibility. And this to me resembles, in part, not entirely, the point that Adolf Burley and Gardner Means made back in the early 30s when they wrote the book The Modern Corporation and Private Property, in which they argued that the management had sort of usurped the traditional prerogatives of capital because they controlled the corporation, but there were many stockholders. Now, I've been instructed and admonished by Naomi Lamoureux and perhaps Julie as well, who come in on this, that in fact there were only a few corporations, which AT&T was the best example, which had thousands and thousands and thousands of corporations. In fact, you kind of have lots and lots of kind of proprietary corporations, even in the early 20th century, or those run by by relatively few people. But nevertheless, I think the insights of Burley and Means are important because I think it applies in a slightly different way to today with the situation in Bangladesh, where what's clearly is the case is you have control but not responsibility, not legal or fiscal, financial, or moral responsibility, and that was the Burley is considered kind of one of the ideological, founders of the New Deal, because what the New Deal sought to do and why it was resonant was to sort of get inside the black box of the corporation and since management was sort of illegitimate, at least in terms, from his point of view in his book, in terms of traditional functions of ownership and capital. Therefore, if it was illegitimate, then either the government or consumers or workers were going to play a role in the governance of the corporation. And I think we're, to some extent, there's an analogy that's going on today. The Walton family, they do in fact own 50% of Walmart. So, the argument that they are not usurping the traditional role of ownership. They own it. They got the stock. They're multi-billionaires. So that's not the issue. But there is the issue in terms of the Walmart or the Target or any of the others, the supply chains in which they clearly control. They're the dominant voice. They control this giant chain. And I love the word supply chain. I like that. It's not, it implies subordination and dominance. I think that's right. And that was created, by the way, by Bain and Company in the 1980s. They were the ones, and I don't know if they were thinking consciously about it, but I think it expresses what we want. So Walmart and other of these retailers or brands, they control the entire production system, but they don't have a certain kind of responsibility. That was what Burley and Means were getting at 80 years ago, and I think it's on the agenda once again today. Even though, as I say, the Walton family, or maybe various kinds of hedge funds or pension funds, in fact, are major stockholders in any of these corporations. Let me just say this about there was a period in the 1950s and 60s. One reason why the influence of Burley and Means faded, and the whole New Deal ethos kind of faded, was a kind of socioeconomic kind of thinking, which is sort of identified with, say, people like John Kenneth Galbraith or Peter Drucker, in which the fact that management did not own the corporation, that they were kind of a technically proficient, a committee in effect. That this was viewed by say, Peter Drucker was the most famous, as a great thing. As a great thing, because this meant you could divorce the profit motive from ownership. And so Drucker writes this book, the Concept of a Corporation, 1945. It's really one of the founding documents of management theory. It's all about General Motors. And Drucker applauds General Motors as saying, this General Motors is a planning bureaucracy. That's great. It's much better than the Soviet Union because it's in a democratic society. But that's what's good about General Motors. They aren't concerned about the profit motive. And it's a kind of lots of the best minds in the country. And later on, Henry Ford will hire Robert McNamara to do the same thing at Ford. A kind of consummate bureaucratic technical managers. Galbraith picks up on that in a new industrial state and said that's what corporations are all about. Now. This is all ridiculous, of course, and I should say that General Motors, it's people like Sloan, they hated Drucker's book, even though they financed it, because they were still invested in the idea that, of course, we aren't powerful at all. It's the customer that's powerful, and we certainly ought to planning bureaucracy. That's what we are. Anyway, Howard Brick, in a wonderful book, about the thought of capitalism, about transcending capitalism. He calls this a sort of socio-economic way of thinking, and I think it's very important. And by the way, the Industrial Relations Research Association, your grandfather or whatever it is, is shot through with that. People like Clark Kerr and John Dunlap. That's the way. That was one of the ideological basis of the whole sub-discipline of which you're still partly involved with. So anyway, but obviously that kind of thinking, is marginalized today, and the rise of everything hedge funds and private equity, et cetera, has made that thinking that management is just a committee that doesn't care about profits as ridiculous. One of the, I discussed this, but one of the features of the erosion and destruction of the New Deal order and of the kind of world that Burley and Means had constructed and Drucker was legitimizing is that you do get the rise of this idea of that, you don't have to have vertically integrated corporations anymore. Now, there are many origins of that. There's a technological basis for that. Barcodes and computers mean, you can just send emails to to Latin America or East Asia, and you don't need to actually, own the thing. Anyone, you've read your Chandler, and you know the argument there, or you read your Ronald Course, and you know the play. But one of the reasons was political. That, and I haven't done a survey research on this, there's some good examples of this. Take United Fruit. The famous, owner of banana plantations in Central America. Yes, 5 minutes left? Okay, fine, no problem. United Fruit decides in 1960, after nationalism and revolution, has made we've got to sell off these banana plantations because this is too dangerous. This is too politically fraught. And so United Fruit does that. They still they figure out how to keep buying, and controlling these plantations, but they don't own them anymore. They don't care if they're nationalized by local government. They're the marketers. And so United Fruit turns itself into United Brands, and basically still runs, does very well in Latin America. Walmart does the same thing. Now, Walmart, in part, one of its competitive advantages was in the United States that it was very, very understood logistics. Walmart's logistics company. So it's quite integrated in the United States. But when it came to sourcing abroad, it also, unlike Sears, for example, or other retailers or A&P, which had their own, manufacturers of refrigerators or their own milk and bread, facilities. Walmart never did that, but they knew, and Sam Walton was very politically attentive to this stuff. So, for example, in the 80s, when Buy America sentiment was on the rise, Walmart makes clear, and especially after Tiananmen Square, if we're going to buy from China, we've got to keep some distance. And so he sets up something called the Pacific Resources Export Limited, which is the world's largest buying agency. He controls it, but he puts 2 levels of bureaucracy between him and the vendors in China from which he's really beginning to buy in mass quantities in the late 80s and the early 1990s. And so there is a kind of political dimension. Other things going on too, to having these supply chains. Now, let me just conclude that I think what's happening today is this, that all of the discourse around from Bangladesh, and goes back 20 years, is to reintegrate the supply chain and to make it resemble in some way a vertically integrated corporation. Now, vertically integrated corporations can be really brutal. There's nothing good about them. I went to Pueblo, Colorado a couple years ago to visit the archive of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation. They're the ones, Ludlow, and it was a gigantic archive. And it was very clear that Colorado Fuel and Iron, owned by the Rockefellers, controlled, half the state of Colorado. There was a room for railroads they owned, a room for worker housing, a room for medicine. They owned it all. But when, after Ludlow, John D. Rockefeller Jr. is called on the carpet, taken to Congress and said, "You're responsible, for the massacre of those workers," and there was no doubt that he was. And in fact, Rockefeller did all sorts of things for the next 50 years to basically get out from under that. If you called, Michael Duke in front of Congress and said, "You're responsible for Bangladesh," he said, "No, no, we aren't. We don't own those companies." So I think what's happening now, and this is clear in whether it's the PK Kenzan case in Indonesia, where Adidas was, there was a factory and the workers were laid off with no money, and people and the University of Wisconsin pressured Adidas to take legal responsibility for those workers, to pay them. And now, of course, with Bangladesh, where H&M, a big European retailer, has agreed that they have a legal responsibility, which you can go to court on this. Walmart, of course, has and others, and American corporations, many of them have said no. So that's what the fight is going on, to reintegrate the corporation, at least to some degree. And one index of this, I'm almost out of time, right?
You can take it on there.
No, well, I'm sort of, well, let me say one thing.
Finish.
No, I'll say about 2 minutes. 1 minute. In the antebellum era, we had no trade unions. Governments were weak and thin. But that was the era in which the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations of that era, were also prodding and pushing the merchants of that era to take responsibility. The first NGO in the world was the British Anti-Slavery Association. Another was the Congo Association, the American Consumers League. These were all kind of humanitarian / political activist organizations. So it's no accident that today, the players in a world dominated by merchant capitalists are, the Workers' Rights Consortium and thousands of other sort of, NGOs of that sort who are trying to, and like the session I just heard before, trying to sort of get some backbone in either corporate codes of conduct and reintegrating the supply chain. And, it's a mixed, whether they're succeeding or not, is a kind of up for debate, and it's a mixed bag. One very small indication that maybe some success takes place is when I was walking down the street in Philadelphia a couple months ago, 3 months ago, and I come across the store American Apparel. They sell sexy T-shirts, right? Teenagers, right? And actually, their clientele is teenagers. And there on the thing, it said American Apparel, made in Los Angeles. And then the same size print, the same thing, vertically integrated manufacturing. So I thought, well, okay, they understand what's going on here. That, what needs to be done, and they viewed it as a bargaining branding device. Thank you very much.